Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Session 1, the foundation course for the training for the new Discrimination Ordinance. We're going to start the training shortly. If you've just joined, if you're hoping to find subtitles and captions for this training, if you just look to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a settings wheel, and you should be able to switch on the captions from there. Equally, on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a question and answer function. If you do have a question while the training is going on, please do post it in there. There will be some time at the end of the session for us to answer some of those questions. And if you don't have time, if you have to go, because it is early in the morning, I recognise that, then we will be putting all the answers on our frequently asked questions section on our website. It's 8 o'clock, so we're going to start the session now, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah to take you through the first section of the Session 1, the foundation course. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to our Course 1 Foundation on Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. I'm Sarah Ash and I'm going to be presenting today with Karen and Nikki. So the consortium, who are we? Well, the lead partners are the Guernsey Institute and Walkers, and we are supported by Equality Guernsey, Focus HR and the Guernsey Employment Trust, GET. And we've come together today to for the start of our training sessions. This is the first training session of 5. The other sessions are session 2, which is our introduction to the new Discrimination Ordinance. And this session will give an overview of the existing discrimination landscape. We'll cover some of the new protected grounds and the different types of discrimination and other prohibited conduct. We'll also look at who the legislation applies to and the procedure for bringing claims and cover remedies and awards. Session 3 covers employers' responsibilities, and this will provide an overview, as I say, of employers' responsibilities under the new ordinance, and we'll look at key provisions in the ordinance. We'll consider the various issues that may arise during the employment life cycle and employers' obligations in relation to each of those. In addition, we'll cover some specific exceptions and provide an overview of bringing claims and remedies. Session 4, which is on service providers' responsibilities. This will cover who the ordinance applies to outside the work context, and will cover service providers, schools and education providers, clubs and associations, and accommodation providers. We'll consider some other examples of discrimination and other prohibited conduct, specifically in this context. And in addition, we'll also consider specific exceptions and provide an overview on bringing claims and remedies in these situations. Finally, session 5, which is on accessibility and reasonable adjustments. This will cover the duties on employers, service providers, accommodation providers and others to make reasonable adjustments and accessibility action plans. So as you can see, the training programme has been designed to give attendees a really high quality understanding of the new discrimination ordinance so that they can prepare in advance of the new legislation largely coming into force on the 1st of October. These sessions can be attended in any order and are all available to book online. So what are we covering today in our foundation session? So this session is divided broadly in 2. So we're going to start by setting the scene on human rights, and then we'll provide a summary of the existing discrimination legislation in Guernsey, and then go on and talk in more detail about the new discrimination ordinance and measures to support it. Part 2 will cover the general principles of equality, diversity and inclusion. We'll look at diversity in Guernsey, unconscious bias, and we'll cover inclusive language. Because when it comes to preventing discrimination, legislation is only part of the solution. So the second half of our session will focus on some of the general principles we should all be bearing in mind and examples of good practice to help us avoid inadvertently discriminating in practice. I'm now going to hand over to Karen, who's going to talk us through an introduction to human rights.
My name's Karen Blanchford and I'm a representative of Equality Guernsey. a group of charities and individuals passionate about equality and rights. We're going to start by talking about human rights at an international level and slowly work our way through into the local Guernsey context. So what are human rights? They are an important set of internationally agreed rights and freedoms that belong to every person. These rights are based on principles of equality, non-discrimination, fairness, self-determination, independence, and respect for dignity and rights of others. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. It was the first legal document to set out the fundamental human rights that were to be universally protected. There are 30 in all, but today we'll just focus on the first two. Article 1 is around all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 2, freedom from discrimination, is what ensures this equality. The power of the Universal Declaration is in the idea that it will change the world. It inspires us to continue working to ensure that all people can gain freedom, equality and dignity. These rights are as relevant in Guernsey as they are in the rest of the world. So what about human rights in small places such as Guernsey? I'd like to quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who is a principal person to set up the Universal Rights and Declaration. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Locally, we are really excited to have the UN Declaration of Human Rights translated into Guernesiese, and we were very grateful to people that took part, for example, Jan Marquis and others, who have translated this document, the most translated document in the world, into our local language. I'm going to pass back to Sarah now, who's going to introduce discrimination legislation in Guernsey.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm now going to talk about discrimination legislation in Guernsey. So as you can see here on the slide, I've set out the existing legislation that we have in Guernsey. So first off, we have the Human Rights Bailiwick of Guernsey Law 2000. This law was registered in 2001 and came into force on the 1st of September 2006. And the human rights law is one of the most significant pieces of constitutional legislation enacted in the Bailiwick of Guernsey. It's intended to encourage a modern civic society where equal rights and responsibilities of our citizens are clearly recognised and properly balanced. Its effect is to allow people to claim their rights under the European Convention on Human Rights in the bailiwick's courts and tribunals, instead of having to go to the European Court of Strasbourg as was previously required. The law underpins this by requiring all public authorities in the bailiwick to act compatibly with the Convention rights. In addition, we have the Sex Discrimination Employment Guernsey Ordinance 2005. Now, this applies in the employment context only, and it prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sex, marital status and gender reassignment. It was extended in 2016 to also cover maternity and adoption leave as other protected grounds. So, moving on to the Prevention of Discrimination Guernsey Ordinance 2022. So the new Prevention of Discrimination Ordinance was passed by the states on the 30th of September 2022, so a short while ago, and will largely come into force on the 1st of October 2023, with some parts to be implemented at later dates. Now, this new piece of legislation will extend protection to other protected grounds, initially with a phase 1, and I'll come on to talk about those protected grounds in a moment. And importantly, it extends protection outside the employment sphere. So unlike the Sex Discrimination Ordinance, which is currently in force, which only relates to employment, the new discrimination ordinance has a wider remit. So the implementation date, as I said, most provisions will come in on the 1st of October 2023. But as I said, some of the duties are going to be staged. So duties on schools and education providers, they won't come into force before 1st of September 2025. Duties to make changes to physical features of premises, not before the 1st of October 2028, and the duty on public sector organisations to prepare accessibility action plans is not before the 1st of October 2028. So clearly this will allow organisations and those bodies that are going to be covered by this new piece of legislation some time to prepare, and I'll come on and talk in a moment and give some further examples. So the UN conventions. So the approval of our new discrimination ordinance means that the states of Guernsey can potentially move forward on other UN conventions, including those listed on the slide, and our new legislation excuse me, will place us in a better position so that we're meeting our obligations on the UN conventions that have already been extended to Guernsey and which we're signed up to. In addition, it will also mean that we may be able to request an extension of the UK's ratification to Guernsey of other UN conventions. I'm now going to cover a summary of the new discrimination ordinance. So moving on now to talk about the protected grounds. As you can see from the slide, I've set out the existing protected grounds, and these are under the Sex Discrimination Ordinance, as I've mentioned earlier. So those are sex, maternity, adoption, marital status, and gender reassignment. Phase 1 are the 5 new protected grounds that are going to be introduced by the new discrimination ordinance, and those will be effective from the 1st of October 2023. And those are, as listed on the slide, disability, carer status, race, religion or belief, and sexual orientation. You'll see on the slide that I've also included a phase 2. Now, we don't have an exact date for when this phase will come in, but it's anticipated to be a minimum of 2 years after phase 1. And we're still to see the policy paper setting out the detail on this, but what we're anticipating is the incorporation of the existing grounds from the Sex Discrimination Ordinance, so those in column 1, into the new discrimination ordinance. And the reason for this is that there are still there's a slightly more limited set of prohibited conduct currently in our existing legislation than in our new discrimination ordinance. So, and also obviously our sex discrimination ordinance, as I've mentioned, is currently limited just to the field of employment. So it will widen out its remit by bringing it into, or bringing those protected grounds into the new discrimination ordinance. In addition, age as a protected ground may well be introduced as part of phase 2. Now, not on the slide is a possible phase 2B, and that would be the introduction of equal pay for work of equal value. Again, there's been nothing decided yet on that phase 2B, and we would be awaiting sort of further policy letters setting out more detail on this. So moving on to look at who does the new discrimination ordinance apply to. Well, it still will apply to employers as our existing legislation, but as you can see from the slide, it's far, far wider reaching than the Sex Discrimination Ordinance. And some of the key additional groups who need to be aware of their obligations under the new discrimination ordinance are providers of goods and services, accommodation providers, schools and education providers, clubs and associations, charities and voluntary groups. Of course, employers will also need to be well prepared in advance of the new legislation coming into force, as they will have these 5 new protected grounds to consider, which will impact policies and procedures and be relevant from recruitment all the way through the life cycle of the employment relationship up to termination of employment. Service providers will cover a wide range of organisations such as restaurants, hotels, banks, transport providers and tradespeople. As I've mentioned earlier, we will be running further courses during these modules, and we'll go into the legislation in greater detail. And session 3 is all around employers' responsibilities under the new discrimination ordinance, and session 4 will cover the requirements for service providers as well, goods and services. And as mentioned, we're also running a session on the reasonable adjustments for session 5, and we know that will be a topic of real interest for everyone. So moving on, I just want to touch briefly on the main forms of discrimination and other prohibited conduct which are going to be set out within the new discrimination ordinance. So firstly, direct discrimination. This is when somebody is treated less favourably because of a protected ground. So for example, refusing to serve someone in a restaurant because of their race. Discrimination by association. This is treating someone less favourably because of a protected ground of someone they associate with. So an example here might be isolating a colleague because they have a family member who is gay. Indirect discrimination. This is applying a policy, criteria or practice, sometimes referred to as a PCP, which disproportionately affects those who share a protected ground and which cannot be justified. So an example here might be refusing to allow an employee to work flexibly where they need to do so for childcare or health reasons, and where there are no good business reasons why the role cannot be carried out flexibly. So there's no justification why the role can't be carried out flexibly in that case. Harassment. This is unwanted conduct related to a protected ground or of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. So that could include, for example, making offensive comments about Muslims. And it's important to note that this is not a type of discrimination under our current legislation. So this is definitely a new form of prohibited conduct that everyone should be aware of. Moving on now to victimisation. This is where you are treating someone unfavourably for raising a complaint under the new discrimination ordinance or supporting someone else's complaint. So an example here might be refusing to renew a lease because the tenant has raised allegations of discrimination in the past. Duty to make reasonable adjustments. This is where a provision, criterion or practice, physical feature of premises or lack of auxiliary aid places a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage. Now, the duty to make reasonable adjustments applies in the circumstances which I've just set out. It's only a duty to make adjustments that are reasonable, so you would need to look at cost and practicality. But examples include allowing people to book your services in a different format, providing equipment that someone needs to allow them to do their job, or making alterations to premises. And we'll come on to cover this in far more detail in our other sessions, particularly in session 5. Discrimination arising from disability. This is treating someone unfavourably because of something arising from their disability, where this cannot be justified. So an example of this is where if an employer may dismiss employees due to absence levels, and if an absence level arises from a disability, the employer would need to be able to justify their decision to dismiss as being proportionate in all circumstances, which would involve looking at things like whether attendance is likely to improve with treatment, and considering carefully the effect of the absence on the business and others, and whether or not reasonable adjustments have or can be made. So what measures are coming in to support the new discrimination ordinance? So firstly, we will see the new Employment and Equal Opportunities Service, EEOS. This was formerly the Employment Relations Services, so ERS, and EEOS will offer free advice and, importantly, pre- and post-complaint conciliation. So free impartial advice and guidance will be available to both parties. They'll focus on the informal dispute resolution. A pre and post complaint conciliation will be offered in all cases, and there'll be proactive education and awareness raising from EEOS. And this will cover a wider remit in the future of all protected grounds, not just sex and not just for employment, and will also cover goods and services providers, education providers and schools, accommodation and membership of clubs and associations. In addition, we can expect to see guidance notes being produced, and these will be available before the new legislation comes into force. These will be an excellent source of guidance for anyone that has questions about the legislation and how it's going to work in practice, and will also set out plenty of examples. We're also going to see some changes in our Employment and Discrimination Tribunal. We'll see the introduction of legally qualified tribunal chairs to consider any claims that may be brought under the new discrimination ordinance, and we're also expecting to see new tribunal rules of procedure. I'm now going to hand back to Karen, who's going to talk about some of the general principles of equality, diversity and inclusion.
This section is normally a one-day course, but today we're going to take a brief overlook so that we can reference it in relation to the new discrimination legislation. Firstly, we're going to start with equality and the difference with equity. So equality is about ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and talents. It is also the belief that no one should have a poorer life chance because of the way they were born, where they came from, what they believe, or whether they have a disability. Equality recognises that historically certain groups of people with protected characteristics, or what we call grounds, such as race, disability, sex, sexual orientation, have experienced discrimination. The term equity refers to fairness and justice. It is distinguished from equality. Whereas equality means providing the same to all, equity means recognising that we do not start from the same place and must acknowledge and make adjustments to these imbalances. Our later session on reasonable adjustments is session 5. In this slide, we show this pictorially. We start with equality, the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports. This is equal treatment. Equity. Everyone gets the support they need. You see in this slide that the boxes have now been distributed so that all 3 people can see over the fence. Next, we look at inclusion. Here, we're looking at removing the barrier. The barrier here was the fence. By removing that barrier, everyone has the same opportunity. About diversity. Diversity is about what makes each of us unique. It includes our backgrounds, our personality, our life experiences, our beliefs, and all of the things who make us who we are. It is a combination of our differences that shapes our worldview and our perspective and our approach. A diverse environment is one with a wide range of backgrounds, mindsets, including neurodiversity, which allows for an empowered culture of creativity and innovation. Later, we'll look at why that's important, whether that's in the workplace, your goods and services provider, or other organisations. Diversity is recognising, respecting and celebrating each other's differences. So how are we different? A lot of the time we think of diversity in terms of just social categories or protected grounds, but there are a large range of areas where difference occurs. I ask you to pause now and think about 5 or a number of examples of what makes us different. How are we diverse from other people? Did your list include some of these examples, or maybe some that aren't included here? This list isn't exhaustive. And maybe there's things on here that you think apply to Guernsey more than other locations. Maybe socioeconomic status, maybe where we went to school, maybe different viewpoints or where we came from, where we were born. All of these things are around how diverse we are and how that impacts on our thinking and inclusion. Next, we're going to play a video about lived experience of disability.
My two main disabilities are visual impairment and autism. I do also have some mental health issues. It takes a lot of figuring out at all points during my day because I'm having to draw in sound and touch and smell to figure out what's going on around me and what I need to do and do things differently. So if post arrives or I'm using a computer, it's doing things in different ways, but it's also quite an intensive and time-consuming way of working. Autism affects communication, sensory sensitivities, I guess. When I am overloaded, I do find communication difficult at times. Figuring out how to do anything gets complicated. So I do need downtime, sometimes increased processing time. Other times I'm absolutely on the ball and really sharp. So it's very variable, but I have to be mindful.
Well, slightly autistic, so sometimes my brain tells me to say something that I don't want to say, but, you know, and my cerebral palsy affects my ability to walk properly and stand for long periods of time and things like that. And a lot of bending and turning does have an impact on my body, you know.
I think it's just this time we're really discovering more about what makes me tick, and sometimes, you know, there's very small differences in them. Sometimes the comprehension of tasks doesn't always hit the mark straight away, and you know there's all sorts of things going on in my mind. I think that's the thing with autism. It's a disability, but the mind is very powerful with it, so it can also be working at 100 miles an hour sometimes.
I had a brain hemorrhage had a stroke, and I literally went from being fit and healthy to being completely immobilised because I lost the whole of my left side, and that occurred in the space of 20 minutes on a Friday evening. And then from that point on, life changed. I was hospitalised for a good 2 months because I needed to be hoisted and out of bed. I was obviously been flown to the UK for scans and analysis of what was wrong. And then I went through a recovery process through occupational therapy and through physiotherapy.
Over the course of our sessions, there'll be a number of lived experience and case studies that hopefully bring to life the work that we've been doing around the new Discrimination Ordinance. Diversity in Guernsey. When we look at diversity, we look at a number of things that we mentioned before. So let's just take a brief look at some of the sources of the data that supports that. Maybe some of these numbers will be a surprise. Also, some of these are quite old and we expect some of these numbers to have moved. The links are in the slide and also referenced at the end of the deck. So please, if you wish to research these further, take a click on the source guide. So first of all, we have 18% of young people identify as LGBTQ+. This was a source from the Young People's Survey. This took place in 2016. So again, we probably expect this figure to be higher. People have 1 in 4 people have experienced a mental health issue. This is not only a global figure and UK one, but also is shown again in our Wellbeing Survey that took place in 2018. Again, following COVID and the situation that we've had during lockdown and more dialogue around human mental health, we expect this figure possibly to grow. The next statistic that is always a surprise to people is that over 13,500 people have a disability or impairment, and more than 4,000 are carers. Again, these figures are on the rise due to an ageing population and also the number of people needing to care for people as they age, also with a disability. This figure is very similar to that in the UK and globally, which is generally between 20 and 25%. What other figures do we have, or how else can we talk about the diversity in the community? 14% of the population is over 70. Again, we're expecting this figure to rise as we all age. 40% of residents were not born in Guernsey. We'll have a look at that data a little later. Ethnicity. At the moment, we have very little data on this. And the following slide, I'm going to talk about the importance of having data. A number of these statistics are taken from the States of Guernsey Facts and Figures booklet. It's just been produced for 2022. You can find this on gov.gg/FF, or again, the hyperlink within our slides. Data on diversity matters. Why? How do we know how we're doing? How can we measure if we're moving forward, if we're progressing? How do we understand how diverse Guernsey is if we don't have data? This is important for us to get a picture of where we are now, where we're going, and what we need to do to support diversity and inclusion. For example, we may want to think about how we produce things in different languages. We may also want to think about how we integrate people from different countries, how we can support that moving forward. Again, this data is taken from the Facts and Figures booklet of the government, and the hyperlink is in the slide pack. We talked about equity, equality, diversity. What about inclusion? So although diversity and inclusion are interconnected, they are far from interchangeable. Diversity is about representation or the makeup of an entity. Inclusion is about how well the contributions the presence and the perspectives of those different groups are valued, and how they're integrated into the environment, whether that's a workplace, whether that's a club, a group, a charity, anything in which we partake in our community. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued. You'll notice the picture here of Rose, and I always think of this when we talk about diversity and inclusion. And earlier in the year, we had a visit from our Jersey counterpart, who also added another element, which is called belonging. I'll take this quote and apply that. Diversity has been invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Kate Wright from Jersey adds another one called belonging, and that's about choosing the music. If we're involved, if we're included, if we belong, those contributions are important to every part of our well-being and society. But how inclusive are we? We all like to think of ourselves as inclusive, easygoing, non-prejudice. If this was a reality, there would be no discrimination. So why do we exclude people? Later, Sarah's going to spend some time on unconscious bias, why that's important, and how we can be more aware of our biases and manage them. Some of the reasons that we maybe exclude people without meaning to is power, social status, prejudices that we have. As we've said before, if diversity is best achieved when people of all backgrounds feel a sense of belonging and are included, it is better for our workplace, better for the community. We're going to take a look at the video that maybe helps us distinguish that. After you've watched the video, I ask you to pause for a moment and think about any biases you may have observed while watching the video.
All rise.
Did the video have an impact on you? Were there any assumptions that maybe you made? Or was there anything that surprised you, and why? As we go through this subject today, equality, diversity, inclusion, we ask you to consider those biases or assumptions that you're making and ask you to recognise those and consider how we can work on those. Next, Sarah's going to take us through unconscious bias.
Thanks, Karen. So what is unconscious bias? I think the first point point, as listed on the slide, is that everyone has unconscious biases, and as that might suggest, these are things that we sometimes don't recognise or don't think about. And this next section is about maybe why we should step back and reflect and think further. So I'm going to talk through some examples now around affinity bias, and this is also sometimes referred to as similarity bias, and this may occur where we treat people more favourably simply because they're like us or others we like. So it could occur when you like or feel you have something in common with people who appear to share your interests, beliefs and background. So for example, thinking someone's qualified for a role because you share the same professional qualifications or have worked at similar companies or gone to the same school or university. The halo effect is another type of unconscious bias, and this is where one trait of a person or thing is used to make an overall judgment of that person or thing. A common halo effect example that's used is attractiveness and the tendency to assign positive qualities to an attractive person. So, for example, you might consider a co-worker who is smartly dressed to be more competent than a co-worker who turns up wearing a t-shirt, or a colleague having the view that women are better caregivers than men, or the view that children from affluent families are better looked after than children from lower socio-economic backgrounds. So what are the risks with unconscious bias, and why does it cause us a problem? Well, it can lead to a less diverse workforce, and that can mean that talent can be overlooked, either when you're bringing talent in or trying to attract new talent into your organisation, or the talent that you already have in place that you're not recognising. Also, very importantly, if it's against a protected ground, sex, race, disability, religion or belief, so forth, it can be discriminatory, and that can place you and your organisation at risk. Unconscious thoughts can be based on stereotypes as well. So it's really important that we think carefully about our behaviours and our actions. And where do we think these biases come from? So as you can see on the slide here, I've set out a few examples. And our biases really are shortcuts and mental maps that our brain forms, and they're based on different things. They might be based on our own experiences, how we've grown up, our background, things that people tell us, our family and our friends, media portrayals, institutional influences, and other external factors. And when faced with people that appear to fit into these mental maps, we can tend to make a number of associations. And as I've said, these are unconscious. So our perceptions and assumptions are based on these associations. They can be at times incorrect. So we do need to take care when making decisions. So moving on to why it's so important to recognise and address unconscious bias. So it can potentially have a negative impact on your organisation. So for example, as I've mentioned before, employers may miss out on talent and the benefits that diversity can bring to your organisation. If you treat employees differently, this could lead to the loss of confidence, a lack of motivation and reduced output. It may be that there's a risk in failing to reward, promote and advance all employees fairly within your organisations. And as I've mentioned, if someone's treated differently because of a protected ground, this could expose you to a risk of discrimination. Service providers may also treat service users differently, and this could lead to the loss of custom and/or a negative impact on their reputation. So, tackling unconscious bias, how can we mitigate it? First off, it's being aware of your own biases. It's taking accountability and responsibility for your actions. Do seek understanding of other cultures and norms. This will help to remove stereotypes. And it's important to create an open and transparent culture. Try and discuss bias and diversity and inclusion issues openly within your organisation, and consider equal opportunities and unconscious bias training. One area that's a common example that's given is at the time of recruitment. So think about the processes, think about how you're bringing people into your organisation, and your processes behind that, and factors that you can introduce to make sure that unconscious bias is removed. I'm now going to hand over to Karen, who's going to talk more about the benefits of diversity and inclusion.
I've taken a number of slides and research links for this because there's a lot of material on this, but today we're just giving you an overview. I felt this was a good place to start. So the top 10 benefits of workplace diversity, that actually is much wider than that. We can apply this into our groups, our charities, any organisation, and even the way that we work if we're, a sole trader or employer. So let's start maybe with the variety of different perspectives. Diversity in the workplace ensures a variety of different perspectives, since it means that employees have different characteristics and backgrounds, and they're also more likely to have different skills and experiences. Consequently, employees in a company with a higher workplace diversity will have access to a variety of different perspectives, which is highly beneficial when it comes to planning, executive and business strategy. Increased creativity. In addition to having a variety of different perspectives from people with different backgrounds, the exposure of such variety leads to creativity. When you put together people who see the same things but in different ways, you are more likely to get a melting pot of fresh, new ideas, thus improving the creativity of your workforce. This isn't just important to anyone maybe in the marketing, IT, design industries, but creativity is key to how we market our businesses, how we work together, how we problem solve. Higher innovation. Diversity in the workplace leads to higher innovation rates. Again, we've seen this as a global exponential rate, as in we don't just keep delivering the same thing to the same market. According to Josh Berson's research, inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be innovative in their leaders in their markets. In a diverse workplace, employees are exposed to multiple perspectives and worldviews. When these various perspectives combine, they often come together in novel ways, opening doors to innovation. This also means that we also may be faster at problem solving. Harvard Business Review, the hyperlinks as I mentioned are in our slides and at the end, found diverse teams are able to solve problems faster than cognitively similar people. Employees from diverse backgrounds have different experiences and views, which is why they are able to bring diverse solutions to the table. The best solution can be chosen sooner, which leads to faster problem solving and more efficiencies. It's also really important that our diversity in our workplace helps us to enable better decision making. Within the links is a white paper around how decision making is made through a company called Cleverpop, and how there is a direct link between workplace diversity and decision making. It is found that those companies using this model have outperformed individual decision makers up to 87% of the time. This has an impact on profits. Number 6, increased profits. Companies are greater workplace diversity and greater for profits is a quote by McKinsey & Company, a global management consultancy firm that conducted research, again with the hyperlink, including 180 companies from in Europe and the United States. They found out that companies were more diverse with top teams are also financial performers, and the diverse workplace makes decision making faster. Let's move into higher employee engagement. Certainly within Guernsey, we're having issues within recruiting. So engagement, retention, all of these things are key to ensuring that we're able to deliver on our strategy. And again, that's not just within the workplace, but whether we are another group, a charity, organisation, or delivering goods and services. Deloitte's conducted some research where they captured views and experiences of more than 1,500 large businesses in Australia. The research shows that engagement is an outcome of diversity and inclusion. The link between diversity, employee engagement is pretty straightforward. When you're included, you're more engaged. When you're more engaged, you produce higher results, have better productivity, and also number 8, reduce employee turnover. All of us locally are looking at this, how to retain, how to recruit, how to be more inclusive. And I'm hoping a number of these examples and the links that we have within these will help you to consider the benefits of having a more diverse and inclusive workplace. It mentions here within that number 8 that basically if we're happier, we're enjoying our workplace, we stay longer, that turnover is reduced, which obviously again has an impact on profits. We head into the last 2, company reputation. Certainly within an island our size, this is really important, and also in attracting staff. If we're seen as a good company, a place where humans are included and involved and where we're socially responsible, those are organisations and their reputation will speak for themselves. Number 10, improving hiring results. Hopefully you can see as we've worked through all of these that that's the bottom line, that all of these things tie together. Diversity in the workplace or within your group is boosted by the brand, is boosted by the desirable place to work. It's boosted by better retention. It's about attracting top talent. The last survey that we looked at is Glassdoor. 67% of job seekers said a diverse workplace was important when considering a job offer. There's a number of other surveys and links within our slides, but I just felt that this one would hopefully pull it all together to talk about the really important benefits of equality, equity, diversity and inclusion. Our next video talks locally about the benefits of an inclusive business.
I'd say myself and my partner came to Guernsey a very short time ago, and we've embraced the community in the same way they've embraced us, and we've managed to build up one of the biggest barbershops on the island as a result of making things accessible for everybody. And it's got us further than we ever imagined or dreamed of. As a point I do put it down to the fact that we do care about everybody that comes into our shop. It's about a balance. It's implementing things you can do to help us just out of kindness. And you know, there's an old saying which says it costs nothing to be kind, and it's so true in terms of like business. You know, there's things you can do to appease something or just to help somebody get access to a great service. If you're offering a great service, it's only natural people are going to want to use it.
I look forward to going. I found haircuts a really stressful experience from childhood onwards. You have to explain what you want. Are they going to match what they do to your hair with what you're trying to ask them to do? It's the noise, the smells, the people, the whole thing is just, I used to dread it, I used to hate it. And now I look forward to it because I know I feel comfortable. And certainly in terms of customer loyalty, there's nothing which would make me want to try somewhere else. I know that I'm getting exactly what I need there. And yes, I do tell people that this is a good example of a place which really gets it in terms of inclusion and understanding, and a lot of it is just that awareness.
Hello, my name's Nikki. I work for Guernsey Employment Trust, and we are a charity that supports disabled and disadvantaged people to prepare for work, find work, and maintain work. I'm going to talk to you today about inclusive language for disabled people, and then I will introduce a really good video that explains inclusive language for LGBTQ+ people. So let's look at inclusive language for disability. We generally find that people want to use language that accurately describes disability, and we work with many advocates for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. But people are worried about getting it wrong. And that's important because inappropriate language can reinforce negative stereotypes. So we do need to be mindful about the language that we use. But the key point is that everybody is an individual. Everybody has different preferences. Just because one person with autism likes to do tasks in a particular way and is happy to use the label autism to describe their impairments, it doesn't mean that somebody else on the autistic spectrum is happy to carry out tasks in exactly the same way, or is even happy to use the label autism. When you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I think the key thing is to remember, don't assume that you know what people want. Have the conversation and ask them what their preferences are with regards to language. When you're speaking in public or doing some writing, it's important that you do your research first to make sure that you're using current terminology and nothing that would be deemed nowadays as inappropriate or offensive. And I actually have a really good example of this because a couple of days ago, when the consortium were getting ready to deliver a training session, there was a word in there that we weren't sure about as to whether it was something that was currently acceptable. So we reached out to the relevant charity that represented that group to just check with them. And we were advised that a phrase that we were planning on using was no longer acceptable in that community. So we changed our wording accordingly. Commonly accepted terminology includes disabled people or a person with a visual impairment or a sensory impairment or a cognitive impairment or a wheelchair user. Many disabled people find annoying or offensive terms such as restricted to a wheelchair, victim of depression, or suffers from anxiety, because these are all very negative in nature. Please avoid terms such as retarded, crippled, deformed, or handicapped. These are no longer acceptable. The term special needs is only used in reference to children, not adults, who find this term quite patronising. But again, if you're not sure, have the conversation and ask people their preference. We're all human, we all make mistakes, and don't let fear of getting it wrong putting you off having that conversation or providing an opportunity to a disabled person. Everyday expressions and common phrases are fine, and don't feel frustrated with yourself if you use a common expression inaccurately. So for example, if you said see you later or walk that way to somebody with an impairment who can't do this, don't let it put you off still having another conversation. The likelihood is the other person will probably be laughing with you, maybe even at you, but just make sure that you correct yourself the next time. Before you help someone, make sure you ask them if they would like your help. And it is good to ask somebody if they would like help. Somebody to you might appear that they're struggling or doing something in a very awkward way, but that might be their way of achieving a task independently. If you do know someone, then you might be able to pick up on cues that they're struggling. So do offer help, but just don't be offended if the other person says they'd prefer to do it on their own. Some people have a tendency to talk louder and slower to disabled people. A person with cerebral palsy, for example, might be a wheelchair user. They might have uncontrolled upper body movements. They might have difficulties with their speech. But it doesn't therefore mean that they have a hearing impairment or a cognitive impairment. So speak to people normally. And you're probably wondering, why am I even saying this? But we do see it ourselves. So speak to people like they're adults, as you would do to anyone of a similar age or in a similar role. Never speak to a disabled adult as if they were a child. If you know that someone is hard of hearing or deaf, it is okay to raise your voice slightly so that they can hear you. But don't over-enunciate and don't cover your mouth, because that person might be lip reading. At Guernsey Employment Trust, we often provide support workers in the workplace, and this is a really valuable, reasonable adjustment to allow somebody to settle into the workplace and with their colleagues. And we'll go into this further in session 5. But what's important to remember is that you focus your interaction on your new employee. That's who you're supposed to be communicating with. It's not to say that you ignore the job coach or the interpreter or the support worker, and there might be times that you need to have a conversation with them, but focus your interaction on the person that you're supposed to be communicating with. And I guess another key sort of takeaway point from me is, if you're interacting with a wheelchair user, don't lean on their wheelchair. That's their personal space. And make sure that you don't move people's assistive equipment, because that's their piece of kit and it needs to be accessible to them. Moving on to the next slide. The States of Guernsey have produced a really fantastic resource in conjunction with a UK company called Access Able. The training is online and it provides you with local stats, information about hidden disabilities. But importantly, this new training also includes video interviews providing lived experience from disabled people. Now, training has been around locally for a few years now, but a new version is about to be launched in November 2022. A link for this will be included in your slide pack, and the training will be uploaded to the consortium website under the resources section. So we would highly recommend you do this. I am now going to introduce you to Ollie Davies from Liberate, who is going to talk through inclusive language for LGBTQ+ people.
Let's start with a few definitions. LGBTQ+ is the place to start. L is for lesbian, which defines women who are sexually attracted to women. Gay is for men who are sexually attracted to men, but also can be an umbrella term for other people, and you can identify as a gay woman. B is for bisexual. That's somebody who is sexually attracted to both men and women. T is for transgender or trans. A trans person is somebody who is moving away from the gender that they were assigned at birth. Q is for queer. This is an umbrella term that many people now adopt, although for people of my age, it can often be a word that is troubling because of how it was used historically. Now we are moving to a point where we are celebrating queer culture and queer identity. And the plus is a really easy way of not having to remember the rest of the letters. But we will look at a few of them now. So people can identify as pansexual, and that is somebody who is sexually attracted to somebody regardless of the gender that they were assigned at birth or how they present now. We also have A for asexual, and an asexual person who is somebody that doesn't have a sexual preference. This isn't a choice not to have any sexual relationships. This is not having a preference, and not having any real desire. Words and definitions are evolving all the time, and it's really important to keep up to date with inclusive language. Some people often ask, why do we need so many labels? Why do we need to be defined in such different ways? And whilst we can hope to live in a utopian future where these labels aren't necessary, it is important for us to be able to find our tribe and find our community and feel safe and accepted, especially in the workplace. It's important to remember that coming out isn't a one-time only event. You don't just come out as a teenager and then never have to declare it again. It can be a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly thing that has to be said repeatedly. Coming out can feel vulnerable. It can be risky for you to say this and not always know the kind of response you're going to be getting. It's important, especially in organisations, that we build a culture where this coming out feels safe and there is no risk. Forcing people to have to declare their sexuality on a daily basis can be very vulnerable. Asking what your wife does without necessarily knowing that the person is married to a woman may make that person feel quite vulnerable. As a gay man, I often get referred to as a wife on a form. Now, these things are small. They may feel insignificant, but for people in the LGBT+ community, having to live in a heteronormative world can make you feel very vulnerable. Whilst things are definitely improving, there is a lot of room for things to still get better. It's important when you think about paperwork in your organisation, forms that people are filling in, that these are as inclusive as possible to make sure that people don't have to feel that they're in a position where they have to come out regularly. It's best practice when thinking about supporting the LGBT+ community within the workplace that you definitely focus on the use of pronouns, making sure that you use the correct pronoun that an employee wants: he, him, she, her, they, them, they, them, spelt with an X or a Z, is a really valuable way of making them feel included and safe within your organisation. On Ireland, Liberate is the LGBT+ charity that can support you in all these matters. They have lots of information, advice and guidance to help support you further. If they don't know the answer to your question, they will work hard to make sure they can find you the information and signpost you to the relevant people.
Thank you, Nikki and Ollie, for sharing those examples. What can I do to drive cultural change? This is how we're going to finish this session, pulling together all of the experience that we've had today from all of the presenters and hopefully the reflection that you've had as we've gone through this section. So, what can an organisation, also an individual, organisation here means all of us, charities, groups, individuals, not necessarily just a business, to drive culture change and encourage compliance? We want to educate our workforce and managers on different types of discrimination and the other prohibited conduct under the new ordinance. By helping people to understand this, hopefully it will mean they're more comfortable and also more prepared to get involved. Consider putting in place an equal opportunities policy. There'll be examples of these, not only maybe within your head office or other groups, or maybe through your groups such as Chamber, IOD, or any of the other business groups, but also through the new Employment Equal Opportunities Service, the EEOS. Take action if employees are not complying with relative policies or otherwise acting in an appropriate way. It's important for people to understand that that behaviour is not okay. Building in support around this to ensure that people understand, are aware, there's training, there's management, is important. Helping them to understand the benefits of workplace diversity, which I covered earlier, will hopefully ensure that people understand why this is important and why we're driving the change. So what can you do as an individual to become a diversity and inclusion role model? Encourage that within your environment. Actively seek to create an inclusive culture, whatever group that is that you're in within the community. Whether that's a workplace, the clubs outside of work, charities, whatever is the work that you're doing in the community. Grow your knowledge and your network. We have a number of these sessions. They're a good start, but many other people offer further examples of what you can do around equality, diversity and inclusion. And as we've mentioned, there's a number of links and videos within these resources. Call out discrimination and harassment should you see it. It's important, if we're a role model, for it not to go unsaid. This is difficult, but it is a really important part of changing behaviour. Make reasonable adjustments where possible. In Guernsey, this is quite a new term for many, but as Nikki's already described from Guernsey Employment Trust, and as Sarah's mentioned within session 5, there are lots of resources out there to encourage you to understand that, to drive that understanding and change. Use inclusive language as much as possible. We've given 2 examples today, but there are many others and many groups, again, that are available should you either struggle with this or want to ensure you're using the most up-to-date terminology. As Sarah talked about in unconscious bias, we ask you to be aware of your own biases and to support others. Throughout this presentation, I've mentioned where you can get more information. So starting at the beginning, we've talked about human rights. There's some good links within the Equality Guernsey website, equality.gg. There's a nice little work study and sort of training that you can do online within Stand Up for Human Rights. It talks a little bit more about that understanding, what they are and what you can do. For local discrimination legislation, there's links with many of us ourselves, but also the states of Guernsey. The link is here within the presentation. The states of Guernsey has a number of different places where this information is stored, so I've included those on Signpost, which is the Disability and Carers website, and also the link not only to the legislation but to the myths. Here are also some of the links to our partners within the training: Guernsey Employment Trust, Walkers and Focus HR. Externally, there's lots of research that we've referenced, plus more. Here's just a couple of those locally and also within our charities and support groups. Finishing off, we'd just like to encourage you to attend the other sessions that we will be running. They don't necessarily need to be in the right order, but it is useful as they do link between each other to understand the introduction of new discrimination ordinance, employers' responsibilities, service providers' responsibilities, and accessibility and reasonable adjustment. Thank you to Sarah and Nikki for taking us through the content of this course. We are now open for questions.
Well, that brings us to the end of session 1. I hope that's been really useful for you, and thank you for joining us. We will be sending you out a certificate of attendance for this session, together with a handout of the slides. We have had a number of questions in the question and answer panel as the session's gone on, and hopefully we've answered most of those, but I'm just going to hand over now to Sarah to answer one of the questions that's come in.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, we've had a really interesting question come in, which is, how do we as employers ensure that our corporate purpose, vision and values do not inadvertently discriminate against either our employees or our customers? So obviously looking at it from an employer and provider of goods and services angle on this one. This is really interesting, and I think when it comes to your corporate sort of purpose and values, I think it's important, I think, to check that those are appropriate. Do they fit your organisation? When did you last review them? And have your employees been involved in that process of what your corporate vision and values are? it's also worth bearing in mind, do your staff know and understand what your corporate values are? I think it's important that staff are aware of these and they're trained on them. But of course, the other thing is that it's quite common now that we see other policies that are there to support those overall vision and values. And those visions and values can be relatively broad. It may be, that we want to include, we want diversity, we want to support that within our workplace and equality. But it's important then to have those other policies in the background. So, for example, things like equal opportunities. And that your staff are aware of those. And of course, that then filters down in any of the internal processes and policies that you have in place. It is important, obviously, to ensure that no policies indirectly discriminate against either employees or customers. And we'll come on to talk about that in quite a lot more detail in sessions 3, which is for employers' responsibilities, and 4, which is our service providers' responsibilities session. So I'd really encourage you to attend those sessions as well, where we'll flesh those points out in more detail.
Great. We've just had another question come in, Sarah, which is, where can we access training for the wider workforce, e.g. on unconscious bias, as well as the new ordinance?
Well, there are some great online tools. I know that Equality Guernsey offer some of those sessions. The states themselves have some online training modules, and we also run those types of sessions for our clients. Sometimes, it may be difficult to get all your workforce or a grouping of employees to attend a session externally. So, we would also come in and offer in-house training for groups of staff if that's appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. So finally then, if there are other questions in the chat, what we will do is put our answers to those on our frequently asked question section on the consortium.gg website. So please do look there. The recording of this session will be available also on our website in January, and we look forward to seeing you in session 2. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.